Hi, folks. I'm Greg McLawsen, the Affidavit of Support lawyer. I focus on helping plaintiffs recover support under the I-864 in federal litigation. I do lawsuits all over the country in federal court, and I serve as a consulting expert in family law cases when the Affidavit of Support is enforced in divorce. Today, who can help me sue under the Affidavit of Support? A common misperception is that the government plays a role in enforcing the Affidavit of Support. And that's understandable because the affidavit is a contract between the sponsor and the United States government. So you would think that if the contract is violated, that it would be the government that steps in and helps to enforce it. In fact, that's not true. To understand that, let's go into the obligations that a sponsor incurs when signing an affidavit of support. There are three of them, two big ones. The small one is that they promise to update their address, which, by the way, I think they never do. And if they don't do that, they can be imposed, they can have a penalty imposed on them, but I think that never happens. But that's not the big one. The two big ones are to, one, maintain the income of the sponsored immigrant at 125% of the poverty guideline. Number two is to repay the cost of any means-tested public benefits, that's things like welfare, TANF, food stamps, that are given to the sponsored immigrant. So those are two different components. That second part is the one that the government plays a role in enforcing. So let's say the sponsored immigrant, during the period of sponsorship, so when the I-864 is still enforceable, goes out and gets Medicaid. By the way, that doesn't typically happen because under the same package of legislation in 1996 that created the Affidavit of Support, most means-tested public benefits were restricted to only what are called qualified aliens. And basically what that means is that during the first 5 years of your residency, even as a lawful permanent resident, you are categorically ineligible for most public benefits. But our system is complicated. There are exceptions to that. States can apply for waivers. There are also exceptions for domestic violence survivors, et cetera. So sometimes you could have a situation where a recent immigrant does get public benefit. Uh-oh. We'll switch cameras here. So public benefits, right? So typically the sponsored immigrant is not eligible for public benefits. But if they do get them, technically they can be recovered. The cost of those benefits can be recovered from an immigration sponsor by the federal government. As a further note on that, by the way, that almost never happens. I am aware of one case in the past 5 years. It was out of the state of Colorado. But as a general matter, typically the Affidavit of Support is not enforced when it comes to that promise about means-tested benefits. But again, that component of the I-864, which pertains to recovering the cost of means-tested public benefits, that's one thing. Government does play a theoretical role in enforcing that. Second component of the Affidavit of Support is the obligation to the sponsored immigrant. So that's the part that most folks are interested in when they are the sponsored immigrant, understandably. This, again, is an obligation of the sponsor to pay to the sponsored immigrant whatever is necessary to maintain that person at 125% of the federal poverty guideline. Government does not play a role in enforcing that component of the I-864. Who does? Well, 8 U.S.C. 1183 A.E.1 creates a private cause of action. That's fancy lawyer talk for the right to bring a lawsuit. And it is private in the sense that it is the sponsored immigrant who holds those rights. So when we're asking who can bring a lawsuit to recover financial support under the I-864, it's the sponsored immigrant. And so in that context, who enforces the Affidavit of Support? Who can help you? Well, it's just like any other civil legal action. So your credit card agreement is a contract. If you lease a car, that's a contract. Mortgages come with contracts. All of these are just private contracts, and the I-864 is just like that. So if you want to recover support from your sponsor, it is up to you as the sponsored immigrant to either A, do that yourself, or B, find a lawyer who's willing to represent you. There is nothing wrong with starting with option A, which is to see if you can do it yourself. The obligation under the Affidavit of Support is fundamentally straightforward. It is to ensure that the sponsored immigrant has income at or above 125% of the poverty guideline. So that's math. If you are unemployed, your entitlement as a sponsored immigrant is to get $1,400 and $1,416 per month under the current poverty guideline. All you got to do is ask, right? Sponsored immigrant has no legal obligations under the contract. They are not a party to the contract. What they can do if they want the money that's owed to them is ask. You can go to your sponsor, put it in writing, and say, you signed this contract, and I would like what's owed to me under the contract. Maybe you can resolve it that way. People, I think, sometimes underestimate the willingness of another party to be reasonable and to live up to legal obligations. So before you assume as a foregone conclusion that your sponsor won't simply pay what they're required to pay under a contract, ask them. Because the worst thing they can say is no. If they do say no, then it's time to talk to a lawyer. What kind of lawyer do you talk to? Well, good question. Again, these lawsuits are all I do. I do the federal enforcement lawsuits all over the United States. And I can tell you from having done a lot of them, that usually the person on the other side of the case will have never touched one of these before. And similarly, when I see cases that I haven't litigated, so the cases that are brought by other plaintiffs' lawyers, typically that's the first time that somebody will have done one of these cases. And sometimes that works out great. Perfect example would be Ross Kinder. He is an attorney who I now work with, and he's in the northern part of Alabama in Birmingham. Ross was a criminal and civil litigation generalist, and he took a case through the federal district court level up to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and he did fantastically. Ross did as good of a job on any of these cases as I've ever seen. And he did that with zero experience in immigration law, no subject area expertise. He just did the hard work to get up to speed. What I see more often is people not getting up to speed. So basically, you have two categories of lawyers. You have civil litigators who have never looked at the immigration statute, or you have immigration lawyers who don't typically do private adversarial litigation over damages. And there are cons on both sides of that. The civil litigators often just don't know fundamental things about immigration law. You have confusion over things as basic as residency status and whether transitioning from conditional permanent residency to residency creates problems for a claim. That's just one random example. And immigration lawyers often just aren't familiar with going through the litigation and, more importantly, the settlement process. If you have somebody who's not familiar negotiating civil damages claims, that's a real disadvantage if what you need is negotiation of civil damages claims. So the one strong recommendation I would have if you are shopping around for attorneys in the private legal services marketplace is just ask them, have you ever done one of these cases? And more importantly, have you litigated one? Because there are plenty of attorneys out there who might say, oh, I do all sorts of cases, and maybe I've handled the negotiation of one of these affidavit of support claims. Well, all right, fine. Have you ever argued one to a federal judge? That's a different deal. You ask to see somebody's track record of success in litigating and winning these cases. And that's probably going to narrow your pool of attorneys appreciably. If you do retain private counsel, remember that the affidavit of support has a fee shifting provision in it. That's at 8 USC 1183A sub C. So you should be able to find counsel who will represent you without out-of-pocket expense, without what's called a retainer payment. So at my law firm, we do virtually all of our litigation at no upfront legal cost to our client, and we are paid exclusively from the proceeds of what we are able to recover. If we don't win, we don't get paid either. There are some firms out there in the United States who do that in affidavit of support litigation. Again, if you're shopping around for options, just make sure that they've actually litigated and successfully prevailed in one of these cases before, and they're not just saying they have. So, bottom line takeaway messages, when it comes to the right to financial support under the affidavit of support, government plays no role in enforcing that for the sponsored immigrant. It's up to the sponsored immigrant to do that himself, herself. You can start by asking for it. And by the way, if you want a copy of my demand letter that I send in new cases, just email me and ask me for it. I'm happy to give it to you. You can use that for your own purposes and sending a demand letter of your own, because it's fine and it is totally appropriate, instead of rushing into litigation, to see if you can just ask for what's owed to you from your sponsor. If that doesn't work, find a lawyer. This is what I specialize in across the United States, but there are other attorneys too. Just make sure when you talk to somebody that they've actually litigated and won these cases before. Hope that's helpful. If you have questions of a general nature, drop them into the comments. If you would like a free consultation about your rights under the affidavit of support, feel free to contact us on our website. If you're a lawyer who's looking for assistance in one of these cases, you're also welcome to contact us, and I'm happy personally to do a phone call with you and chat about your situation. Hope this is helpful. Sorry for the weird camera issues, everyone, and have a lovely weekend.